In the Middle Ages, a time when castles rose like stone titans atop green hills, armors clanged with every knight's step like a chorus of clumsy blacksmiths, and villages buzzed with the clamor of carts, markets, and the occasional uproar of a rooster with something urgent to say, humanity faced a challenge as old as it was inescapable: dirty water. We're not talking about a puddle with a bit of mud you could hop over, but water so contaminated it could turn a night of laughter at the tavern into a desperate dash to the apothecary, stomach churning, and a list of prayers to the heavens to avoid ending up in the churchyard. In an era without laboratories, reverse osmosis filters, or even a clear notion of what bacteria, viruses, or protozoa were, medieval people developed a method to purify water that was, for lack of a more precise word, absolutely astonishing. This system, born from observation, trial and error, and a generous dose of ingenuity, not only saved lives but showed that even in times of swords, dragons, at least in legends, and superstitions about evil spirits, people could be surprisingly clever. Let's dive into this fascinating process, step by step, as if we were in a 13th century village, holding a bucket of suspicious water with a smell reminiscent of the neighbor's stable and a firm resolve not to end the week with a fever. Or worse, as the subject of the priest's next sermon on the fragility of life. Picture a typical medieval village. Wooden houses with leaky thatched roofs, a market where merchants shouted their wares, competing with the clucking of chickens and the grunting of pigs, and a well in the village square that, at best, offered murky water with a color that made even the bravest hesitate. Rivers, wells, and streams were the main water sources, but they weren't always as crystal clear as depicted in knight and princess movies. Rivers, especially those running through villages or towns, could be polluted with human waste, animal manure, or the remnants of crafts like leather tanning, which produced a stench strong enough to make a charging knight lower his lance and retreat. Wells, though more controlled, weren't free from problems. A storm could sweep dirt, leaves, twigs, or something far less pleasant into the water, and it wasn't uncommon for an animal, a rat, a sheep, or in the worst cases, a wayward pig, to fall in, turning the well into an unappetizing soup no one wanted to taste. People of the time didn't know about microorganisms, bacteria, or pathogens, but through sheer experience and a well-trained nose, they understood that water with a murky hue, a swampy smell, or a taste reminiscent of yesterday's broth wasn't exactly a recipe for health. In their minds, such water might be cursed or poisoned by evil spirits, but their solutions, though sometimes guided by superstition, had a practical foundation that leaves us, frankly, astounded today, and not just because of the water's smell. The medieval method for purifying water wasn't a universal recipe scribbled in a secret grimoire hidden in a castle's tallest tower, nor was it a spell whispered by an alchemist under a moonless sky. It was, rather, a set of practices that varied by region, available resources, local knowledge, and, often, sheer desperation to avoid illness. Yet, there was a common core that appeared in many places, from the cold northern lands of Europe to the sunny Mediterranean valleys. Sedimentation, filtration, and, in some cases, a rudimentary chemical treatment that, though primitive, foreshadowed modern purification techniques. This process was simple enough for a peasant with a bucket, a clay jar, and some time to implement, yet flexible enough to be refined in monasteries or castles, where resources were more abundant and knowledge, at times, more systematic. You didn't need to be an alchemist with a lab full of bubbling flasks or a noble with a retinue of servants hauling barrels. With some sand, charcoal, a decent cloth, and a good dose of patience, you could turn a dubious liquid into something that, with luck, wouldn't send you straight to the graveyard or make you the talk of the village. The first step was sedimentation, a process so simple even a child could grasp it, but one that required a virtue not everyone mastered: patience. The idea was to fill a container, a clay jar, a wooden barrel, a metal bucket, or even a humble ceramic pot in poorer homes, with contaminated water and let it sit. Gravity, that invisible force medieval people didn't understand but respected as if it were a divine mandate, did the heavy lifting. Larger particles like mud, sand, bits of leaves, twigs, insects, or whatever the wind or a careless cow had dragged into the well would sink to the bottom, leaving the water at the top clearer. This could take a few hours to a full day, depending on how murky the water was and how long the villager was willing to wait, likely preoccupied with other concerns, like avoiding an extra tax from the feudal lord for owning one too many chickens. In poorer households, sedimentation was rudimentary. You filled a bucket or jar, set it in a corner of the house, perhaps near the fire to keep it from freezing in winter, and waited. Meanwhile, life went on. Women wove, men worked the fields, children scampered around dodging puddles, and dogs barked at anything that moved. In monasteries, where organization was practically a religion in itself, sedimentation was done with more care and precision. Monks used large clay jars, often adorned with religious motifs, crosses, or even Latin inscriptions invoking divine protection, because, in the Middle Ages, a little heavenly help never hurt. These jars might have a layer of clean gravel or sand at the bottom, not only to trap heavier particles but also to give the process a sense of order, as if the water knew it had to behave better in a monastery. In some cases, monks and clever villagers added wood ash to the water. Yes, you read that right, ash. Not because they wanted to make the water more interesting or thought it was a magical ingredient from a fairy tale, but because ash, being slightly alkaline, helped fine particles like dust or silt clump together and sink faster, a phenomenon we now call coagulation. This trick was especially common in forested regions of Europe, like the dense woods of Germania, northern England, or Scandinavian valleys, where wood was plentiful and fires were a daily necessity. The ash came from the remnants of fires used for cooking, heating homes, or working metal, and while it wasn't a miracle cure, it made a noticeable difference. Not all medieval people were masters of patience, of course. Some, eager to speed things up, stirred the water thinking it would help the particles settle, an effort as useful as trying to put out a fire with a lit torch. But the more experienced, whether through tradition, observation, or lessons learned after a few stomachaches, knew time was their ally. Clearer water after a few hours of rest was the first step towards something that, at least, didn't make you question your life choices when drinking it. In more advanced villages or the homes of merchants and nobles, containers designed specifically for sedimentation were used, with a small tap or hole near the base to drain the murky water from the bottom, leaving the cleaner liquid at the top. These containers weren't common in every household, but in castles, wealthy merchants' homes, or monasteries, they could be a status symbol, like saying, "Look, my water isn't just drinkable, I purify it with style." In some cases, conical jars were used to facilitate the separation of sludge and clean water, or barrels with internal compartments allowed the water to be poured in stages. These designs, though rudimentary, show that medieval people didn't just rely on luck or prayers but paid attention to detail and sought ways to optimize their resources. Once the water had settled and the bottom of the container looked like a graveyard of mud, twigs, and who knows what else, it was time for filtration, the true heart of the medieval method. This is where medieval ingenuity shone, using materials we'd consider basic today but were true treasures back then: sand, charcoal, and cloth. Sand was the undisputed queen of filtration, and not just any sand would do. They preferred clean sand, collected from rivers, streams, or beaches, carefully washed to remove impurities like dirt, leaves, or small pebbles. This sand was layered inside a container, often a clay jar with a small hole at the base or a modified barrel with a rudimentary drainage system. Water was poured from the top, and as it passed through the sand, smaller particles like silt, dust, or organic matter were trapped in the sand's pores, leaving the water clearer as it exited. Choosing the right sand was no trivial matter. In coastal regions, like those near the Mediterranean, beach sand was popular but had to be thoroughly washed to remove salt, which could make the water undrinkable. In inland rivers, like the Rhine, Danube, or Thames, the sand was finer and often easier to work with but still required cleaning to ensure it wasn't contaminated with mud or plant debris. In some cases, villagers heated the sand over a fire to sterilize it, a step not always necessary but indicative of a surprising level of care for an era when hygiene wasn't exactly a universal priority. The sand was layered in varying thicknesses, sometimes alternating between fine and coarse grains, to maximize particle capture. This system wasn't perfect, but it could remove a significant amount of sediment, turning water from a murky broth into something that, at least, didn't make you wince at the sight. Charcoal was the other star of the show, and here's where medieval people start to look like modern chemists, minus the white lab coats, safety goggles, or complex equations. We're not talking about the charcoal you'd use for a backyard barbecue, but would burn in a controlled low-oxygen fire, creating a porous material that acted like a magnet for impurities. Medieval people didn't know that activated charcoal, as we call it today, has a microscopic structure that traps organic contaminants, chemicals, and even some light metals. But they did notice that water passed through it smelled less like a swamp, tasted less like defeat, and was generally more palatable. This charcoal was made by burning wood from trees like oaks, beeches, or pines in a carefully controlled fire, a process mastered by blacksmiths, monks, and even some villagers. Often, layers of sand and charcoal were alternated in the container, creating a multi-layered filter that was surprisingly effective at removing sediments, odors, and some organic contaminants. Imagine a clay jar with a layer of coarse sand at the bottom, followed by a layer of charcoal, then fine sand, and perhaps a final layer of charcoal for good measure. It was like a medieval filtration cake, where each layer had a specific purpose. Coarse sand trapped larger particles, charcoal removed odors and unpleasant tastes, and fine sand caught smaller particles that slipped through. The water that came out wasn't crystal clear like a mountain spring, nor was it free of all contaminants, but it was clean enough to drink without fearing a trip to the apothecary's bed, or worse, the village graveyard. In wealthier homes or monasteries, these filters could be more elaborate, with containers designed specifically for filtration, like jars with multiple compartments or barrels with wooden pipes for a steady water flow. Cloth also played a crucial role, especially in humbler homes where sand or charcoal wasn't always available. A piece of linen, wool, or even hemp, folded several times to increase its density, served as an improvised filter. Water was poured slowly through the cloth, which trapped larger particles like dirt or plant debris and, with luck, some of the stable-like smell or whatever else the well had decided to offer that day. This method wasn't as effective as sand or charcoal, but it was better than drinking straight from the well, especially if the well had been visited by a stray sheep or a forgotten bucket. In monasteries, where hygiene was a priority, at least in theory, as even monks could be lax in their habits, cloths were boiled beforehand to ensure they didn't add more dirt to the water. This detail shows that monks weren't just praying, copying manuscripts, or tending their gardens. They were also thinking about how to keep water as clean as possible, an effort that likely saved more lives than their prayers could claim. In more advanced villages or the homes of merchants and nobles, containers designed specifically for sedimentation were used, with a small tap or hole near the base to drain the murky water from the bottom, leaving the cleaner liquid at the top. These containers weren't common in every household, but in castles, wealthy merchants' homes, or monasteries, they could be a status symbol, like saying, "Look, my water isn't just drinkable, I purify it with style." In some cases, conical jars were used to facilitate the separation of sludge and clean water, or barrels with internal compartments allowed the water to be poured in stages. These designs, though rudimentary, show that medieval people didn't just rely on luck or prayers but paid attention to detail and sought ways to optimize their resources. In some regions, particularly in Northern Europe, porous stones like limestone or sandstone were used as part of the filtration system. These stones, placed at the bottom of a container or carved into channels, allowed water to flow slowly while trapping impurities. Limestone, in particular, had an added benefit. Being slightly soluble, it released small amounts of calcium into the water, which could neutralize certain acidic contaminants and improve the taste. Medieval people didn't have pH meters or spectrometers to analyze chemical composition, but experience told them that water passed through these stones was safer and, hopefully, didn't taste like defeat. In some cases, these stones were combined with sand and charcoal, creating a filtration system that, while primitive, was a direct precursor to the filters we use in homes or water treatment plants today. In mountainous regions like the Alps, Pyrenees, Carpathians, or Apennines, porous stones were especially popular because nature provided gravel and rocks in abundance. Villagers carved channels into stone or built small reservoirs where water could filter slowly through layers of rock and gravel. In some cases, these systems were so elaborate they resembled engineering feats rather than simple homemade filters. For example, in some alpine monasteries, monks built rudimentary aqueducts that channeled water from a nearby stream through a series of stone channels, where it was filtered before reaching storage jars. These systems not only provided clean water but also showcased medieval people's ability to work with their environment, adapting to the limitations of their time with creativity that seems almost magical today. And then there was the final touch, one that makes this method feel like it came straight out of an alchemy book or a fantasy movie. Rudimentary chemical treatment. In regions where certain plants grew, like elderberry, myrtle, mint, rosemary, or lavender, their berries, bark, leaves, or flowers were used to treat water. These plants contain antimicrobial compounds, and while medieval people didn't know about bacteria, viruses, or pathogens, they noticed that water treated with these plants was less likely to make people sick. For example, crushed elderberries could reduce bacterial loads, while mint or rosemary leaves improved the taste, making the water, if not delicious, at least tolerable. In some cases, vinegar or sour wine was used, as their acidity helped kill some microorganisms. This wasn't common in every household, as vinegar and wine were valuable resources, especially in times of scarcity. But in monasteries, noble homes, or prosperous villages with access to these ingredients, it was a practice that made a difference. The use of vinegar, in particular, was a trick inherited from older traditions, possibly the Romans, who also used vinegar to treat water and as a disinfectant. In the Middle Ages, vinegar was made by fermenting fruits like apples, grapes, or pears, and while it wasn't as common as water or beer, it was available in many households, especially in wine-producing regions like southern France, northern Italy, or the Rhine Valley. Adding a few drops of vinegar to water not only helped kill some microorganisms, but also gave it a slightly tart flavor that, compared to the smell of a swamp, could be considered an improvement. In monasteries, monks sometimes mixed vinegar with herbs, creating a kind of tonic used both to purify water and to treat minor ailments like stomachaches, mild fevers, or even as a remedy for hangovers after particularly enthusiastic celebrations, though, of course, monks didn't admit this in their chronicles. If you want to dive deeper into this topic, I've linked a book in the description that explores not only medieval purification methods, but also how our ancestors managed other essential resources like food, medicine, personal hygiene, and tool-making with ingenuity that rivals any modern startup. If you're fascinated by this journey into the medieval world and want to keep discovering how our ancestors solved problems with creativity, don't forget to subscribe to our YouTube channel. Click the subscribe button, ring the bell, and join our community so you don't miss any videos where we unravel the secrets of the past with a touch of humor and a wealth of information. Now, the medieval method wasn't perfect. It had its limitations and wasn't a magical fix for all water problems. For instance, it couldn't remove chemical contaminants like heavy metals, which might be present due to mining, mineral-rich soils, or waste from crafts like metal smelting. Its effectiveness against microorganisms also varied depending on the quality of materials and the care taken in the process. If the sand wasn't clean, the charcoal poorly prepared, or the cloth dirtier than the water itself, the filter could be more decorative than functional, like armor that looks impressive but crumbles at the first blow. In times of war, famine, or drought, water purification could take a back seat to the urgent need to find any liquid to drink, even if it was a murky broth that smelled of defeat. In cities, where dense populations and the lack of sewer systems turned rivers into cesspools and wells into health lotteries, the challenge was even greater. Rivers running through cities, like the Thames in London, the Seine in Paris, the Arno in Florence, or the Tiber in Rome, were more like dumping grounds than sources of drinking water. The absence of sewage systems, combined with constant dumping of human and animal waste and craft byproducts, made river water nearly undrinkable without serious treatment. Here, the medieval method adapted to the circumstances, but with greater difficulty. City dwellers often relied on water sellers, who hauled barrels of clean water from rural springs or less contaminated streams. But these sellers weren't always trustworthy, and more than one simply filled their barrels from the same polluted river, charging a premium for water barely passed through an old rag or an improvised filter. In wealthier urban homes, more elaborate filtration systems were used, with multiple layers of sand, charcoal, stones, and herbs, sometimes combined with vinegar or sour wine. These households could afford high-quality clay jars, barrels with compartments designed for filtration, or even private aqueducts bringing water from cleaner sources. But for most of the urban population, water purification remained a homemade process, relying on available resources and knowledge passed down through generations. In many cases, women in cities, just like in villages, were responsible for this process, and their expertise was crucial for keeping families hydrated and, hopefully, free of disease. Despite these limitations, the medieval method was a testament to human resilience. In a world where disease lurked around every corner, life expectancy was more a suggestion than a guarantee, and scientific knowledge was limited to what could be seen, touched, smelled, or, in the boldest cases, tasted. People found ways to survive. And not just survive, but thrive. The vibrant medieval markets, filled with trade, colors, smells, and the occasional chicken thief, the Gothic cathedrals reaching toward the sky in defiance of gravity, and the emerging universities in cities like Bologna, Paris, Oxford, Salamanca, and Cambridge are proof that, even with questionable water, humanity pressed forward, building, learning, and dreaming of a better future. The medieval purification method, with its blend of sedimentation, filtration, and natural treatment, was a key tool in that effort to keep diseases at bay and communities functioning. But beyond its functionality, this method is a lesson in ingenuity and adaptability. Medieval people didn't have microscopes, laboratories, or chemistry manuals, but they had eyes to observe, hands to experiment, and minds to learn from their mistakes. Every clay jar, every layer of sand, every handful of charcoal was the result of centuries of trial and error, of generations facing the same problem and finding solutions that, while not perfect, were good enough to keep humanity moving forward. In a way, medieval people were the MacGyvers of their time, solving problems with whatever they had at hand. Be it a handful of sand, a piece of charcoal, a few mint leaves stolen from the neighbor's garden, or a pinch of vinegar saved for a special day. Let's consider the relevance of this method today. In a world dominated by technology, where we have access to bottled water, activated carbon filters, reverse osmosis systems, and industrial treatment plants, it's easy to forget that simple solutions are often the most effective. In emergencies, like natural disasters, wilderness camping, expeditions in remote areas, or regions with limited access to potable water, the principles of the medieval method remain useful. Imagine you're in a forest, far from civilization, with a murky stream as your only water source. With some clean sand, a piece of charcoal from a campfire, a cloth to filter, and a few drops of vinegar or mint leaves, you can create a system that, while not perfect, could save the day. This method reminds us that innovation doesn't always require advanced technology, state-of-the-art labs, or million-dollar budgets. Sometimes, observing nature, using what's at hand, and trusting accumulated knowledge is enough. To wrap up, let's reflect on what this method teaches us about human resilience. Medieval people lived in a world where survival was a daily battle, where dirty water, disease, war, famine, and the unexpected were part of life. Yet they didn't give up. They found ways to adapt, experiment, learn from their mistakes, and share their knowledge with future generations. The medieval water purification method is more than a historical trick or a dinner party anecdote. It's proof that, even in the darkest times, humanity has the capacity to find solutions, to turn a bucket of murky water into a vital resource, and to keep moving forward, step by step, jar by jar, with hope for a better future. And if you want to keep exploring how history teaches us to survive and thrive, don't miss our YouTube content, where we break down these topics with a touch of humor, a dash of curiosity, and plenty of information to feed your mind.